These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. The kingdom of Urartu, called Biainilli, or the land of the Bia people in its own day, has now well and truly been founded. And in record time, too. Sarduri founded Tushpa, modern-day Van, around 840 or 835-ish, and then he died around 828. And then his son Ishpuini ruled independently for another 8 years. Now we're about to see the tag team of Ishpuini and his son Menua build out on that foundation and form a proper empire, which will, for the next century, genuinely intimidate the Assyrian Empire and strategically restrict them, something almost no one else is able to do in a sustained way in the entire history of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. We looked last episode at Ishpuini's religious policy. One of the first things he did, if not the first thing, was adopt the warrior god Khaldi as the national emblem, a god imported from the city of Musasir, also called Ardini, from the southern mountains south of Lake Van. Now that he has this, and he's probably also inherited an Assyrian-style army from his father, he spends the next 8 years waging war in every direction. He has a primary goal in mind, a goal of rapid expansion, both in territory and population capacity. The Tushpa region has a few dozen square miles of farmable area, and he's continuing his father's projects of extensive terracing, cisterning, and water transport to maximize the fertility of the small patch of Eden he has available to him. Importantly, the massive fortress at the heart of Tushpa is critical to such capital investments, as are the other fortresses he's building around that valley. Remember, one of the biggest barriers to capital improvement projects that increase yields is the tendency for them to get destroyed in battle and raids. The fortress nature of the whole valley, plus of course the literal fortresses in the middle, are securing these investments, but only to the extent that there are no enemies that can reach into the valley. We imagine that other warlords in this area would have recognized this as well, but they would have lacked the ability to secure an entire region as a base of operations until now. Ishpuini, however, has inherited this secure and steadily improving base, one of the most fertile regions in the Armenian highlands, and he's already begun to reach out and grab the next little islands of fertility. In 8 years, he secures or begins to secure 2 more of these, the Muradye region to the northeast and the Ursus region a bit past the north edge of Lake Van. Each of these is a bit smaller than the Tushpa region, but still a few dozen square miles of good farmland. He secures them with a fortress each, Karahan and Patnos, and oversees the building of 4 more fortresses around his little Tushpa region, and thus solidifies Biainilli's hold over the most important agricultural regions near Lake Van. He has, in effect, now secured his hold on this entire chunk of the highlands because no other mountain people is going to have enough food to grow past how much Biainilli can grow now. It's only external threats that he needs to worry about. And quick note on all of those locations, a lot of those are the modern names. We don't have, or we're not always certain of, the actual Urartian names of a lot of these sites, so we go with Armenian or Turkish names for them, and I just pick whatever the literature I happen to be reading is. Don't read too much into it. I'm still not sure if I am going to do a political episode on Urartu matters or not. It's pretty depressing. Anyway, we have very few objective year markers for all of Ishpuini's growth throughout his reign. We get a sense of history really divided by the eras of each king, but we don't have year-by-year annals here. One thing we can say for sure is that only 8 years passed And in just that short period of time, not only had Ishpuini managed to take the entire Lake Van region, including the 3 most valuable fertile valleys, but he also managed to extend his territorial control all the way to the western shores of Lake Urmia. And we can't really say for sure who was living in any of these areas previously, but we have to imagine that this valuable real estate was probably not given up without a fight. A procedural note on this, now that we are talking about Lake Urmia, archaeology in that region is much weaker than archaeology around Lake Van. This is because Urartian excavations in the modern period only seem to have really begun in the 1970s, and the Iranian Revolution in 1979, followed by 8 years of war against Iraq, put a complete halt on all academic mapping and investigation of an area that was distressingly near the border and therefore war region. I'm certainly no fan of the Iranian government, but I genuinely can't blame them for that. And while they spent a lot of the 90s recovering from that war, the Iranian government has funded a respectable amount of archaeology into specifically Urartian regions over what seems to have been the last 15 or so years. There hasn't been a ton of work done in the region, but honestly no one spends a ton of effort on Urartu, and so the eastern side is definitely many decades behind the work happening in other countries, but I do give them credit for trying. What that means here is that we can't say for sure if they had built a fortress somewhere on the western Urmia shore by 820. If they had, it would seem to be both an extremely rapid expansion and a tremendously fast construction, a feat of both military and civil logistics. If they hadn't, however, then we somehow have to explain why Ishpuini's army was there in 820, only 8 years after Ishpuini had taken the throne and only 15 years after the foundation of the kingdom. If he hadn't conquered out there, then he must have had various tribes or kingdoms from even that far out, joining Biainilli voluntarily. Biainilli, in either case, has become a big deal in a short time. Now, I mentioned 820 is a big year for 2 reasons. First is that we know Shamshi-Adad and his Turtan had taken the army up north, and it's really probably just his Turtan, as we discussed in the Shamshi-Adad episode way back when, I don't even remember what episode number that was, but it's partly because the Assyrians really needed to secure horses for Shamshi-Adad's various ongoing conflicts, but also, the Assyrians never liked it when a small kingdom that had once pledged to Assyria had changed their alliance, in this case to Urartu. And so the Assyrian army actually goes up to the lake, to the western shores of that lake, because this change in alliance is absolutely morally unacceptable for the Assyrians. Unacceptable or not, we do hear about the expedition in that year, but we hear nothing concrete about any victories up north, which of course lets everyone know that Urartu is more than a match for Assyria, so long as the battle is held on highland soil. No more are we going to hear about Assyrian kings marching proudly through the northern mountains, leveling everything in their way, and it's going to be a serious strategic issue for Assyria. Where are they going to get all their horses, which is part of what drives them deeper and deeper into eastern Iran. Central Iran, but it's east of Assyria. The other thing in 820 is that Ishpuini names his son Menua as his heir in this year. Now, heirs usually aren't that important, but from 820 until Ishpuini's death in 810, so a full decade, Ishpuini and Menua are going to present themselves like a dynamic duo, claiming joint credit for nearly everything the country does in this decade. And we don't actually think that Ishpuini is infirm during this period with Menua as king in all but name. Rather, they seem to be deliberately adopting a pattern of co-rulership in order to expand the administrative capacity of the Biainilli state and to make sure that Menua is fully up to speed when the transition does happen. Much like how the Roman Empire got too big for just one emperor, Urartu is much smaller, but it's much more fragmentary up there in the mountains. And by keeping co-rulership strictly within the line of succession, the kingdom can avoid some of the intrigue that plagued the Roman examples of co-rulers. When going to war, the two seem to have fought as a team, with the god Khaldi at the head of the battle. This is the first period of Biainilli history where we start to get battle reports in the surviving records. In form, they're indistinguishable from most of the generic Assyrian records, and unfortunately, we don't have anywhere they attack that is places that we know from Assyrian records. But from the places experts can identify, we can tell that they're reaching up towards the modern Caucasus nations of Armenia and Azerbaijan, quite a ways from their home base, and starting to secure the area just south of Lake Sevan, making them the masters of the three lakes of the Armenian highlands. It seems likely they're also attacking into the various river valleys even beyond this triangle of the three lakes. It's hard to mark exactly what they're doing here, but they are certainly doing it ambitiously. Ishpuini and Menua report their army sizes quite precisely in this period. In one place they report 9,174 cavalry, 12,704 infantry, and 106 chariots, which are of course numbers precise enough that they certainly seem like real counts. Not only is it impressive to have 20,000 men under arms up in these mountains, it's also quite close to 40% cavalry, something even more logistically heavy in these logistically challenging areas. Armies this large, all with well-crafted iron equipment, are hugely expensive and has a critical implication that the economic structure of the Biainilli kingdom was radically different from that of Assyria. At least from Assyrian records, we get the strong impression that the Assyrian military paid for itself in a certain sense. It was a mechanism for transforming grain, which Mesopotamia typically had a surplus of, into durable goods like slaves, textiles, metals, and luxuries. In the Armenian highlands, however, a land which previously barely had the resources to feed itself, is now fielding a 20,000-man army at the same time as it's constructing fortresses and temples out of stone. And remember that stone is going to be more manpower and craftsman intensive than an equivalent mud brick structure, at least in the initial construction. And at the same time, they're devoting a significant part of the population to metals mining and metal working. See, in the ancient world, we're used to assuming that nearly everyone is a subsistence farmer for most of the year. And archaeology indicates that Tushpa, by far the largest city in the region already, would not have had a population higher than 50,000 people in this entire period, and it probably hasn't even reached that peak yet. This means that we've got an unexpectedly high percentage of people in Biainilli lands who are occupied with non-food production tasks, which in turn means that the food production which is occurring is unusually productive. They aren't just growing by conquering, though, that, of course, they are partly growing by conquering, but there's something inexplicable here as well. There simply isn't that much agricultural capacity in the lands that they are taking to be the ultimate source of all this growth. Now, for Urartu, you see, very unusual in the ancient world, the growth comes before the expansion. They conquer a new valley, whether it's the Tushpa pastures or some small river valley, and when they get there, they've got to find it badly overpopulated. Then they take it over and they improve it in absolutely record time, and suddenly the carrying capacity of the Urartu lands are a marked step higher than they were under the previous old way of doing things. It's like jumping a few steps up the tech tree in a single sweep, and then having the administrative capacity to handle these upgrades in rapid succession. Now, if it sounds like I'm repeating myself, like I'm hammering on about the same thing over and over again, that's probably because I am. I believe the most significant thing about the Urartu story is this dramatic and sudden change in the economy of the region. An economy that would, in many ways, persist into the long later history of the highlands, supporting the kingdom of Armenia from antiquity to the Middle Ages. Only the destructions of the Turkic and Timurid invasions, when the Armenian population was systematically displaced from much of the region, only that would see the population again start to decline. And while there's now, modern agriculture available, it's the period of Muslim rule and its erasure of native populations that has turned this region back into a backwater. We forget far too often that Armenia was a major player in the classical period from the Iron Age into the Christian era. And of course there would be more advancements in the classical and medieval eras. The foundation for that is being laid here by Sarduri and his direct descendants. Now, to be fair, the main alternative here is to suggest that this region always had a population that large and always had a carrying capacity that was larger than we might expect, but somehow something unique about the cultural situation made them uniquely unable to show that population in the archaeological record until the Urartu period. Or, there could be something even more unusual going on here, but I do think the hypothesis that a sea change is going on here in the highlands is the most plausible explanation, even if that is itself somewhat remarkable. Anyway, Ishpuini and Menua are able to take their 20,000 strong army and move it all over the land. As always, the key to large armies in the ancient world is a powerful logistics network, and Biainilli is building fortresses like crazy. These are logistical centers, allowing large armies to move long distances at decent speed. We aren't sure if they have started the road building projects yet that are really going to accelerate this, but at the very least the logistical demands of having so many fortresses are going to mean that there are known, clear, and regularly traveled routes between fortresses, allowing armies to travel internally without eating up their own supplies or, as sometimes happens, getting lost wandering in the mountains. Remember that for most of history, from antiquity to the Middle Ages, our typical estimate is that an army can travel about 10 miles in a day unless it's unusually motivated or capable. Given the road networks that have been estimated in the region, this gives an estimate about 16 days travel between Lake Van and Lake Urmia, or 4 days travel for a single highly motivated messenger. Those estimates come from the road networks as they were present in the 1800s, and while the basic ways were likely the same for most of human history, we can only assume that Biainilli roads were as good or worse than they were in more recent times. And all of that means Ishpuini and Menua had been building out roads and way stations and fortresses at an astonishing rate to improve the transport capacities of these mountain passes enough for an army to move through the region. After all, the further you go past that 16-day estimate from Van to Urmia, the more costly it becomes just to move troops from one often attacked region to another. Interesting to note also that Biainilli seems to really have needed that 20,000 strong army, at least on some of the campaigns it embarked upon. We only know of the nation's successes, of course, and given the rapidity of its expansions, it might not have had too many failures. But it's taking Assyrian-aligned border regions, and it's taking over peoples of the Caucasus Mountains. It's taking over often very established tribal groupings who had long practice in defending their valleys from invaders. Biainilli is winning because it has the best logistics and overall governing system, but also because they can operate and conquer in this hostile terrain better than anyone else. Now, this tag team of Ishpuini and Menua lasts almost exactly a decade, from about 820 to 810, and the size of the empire at least doubles in this period. Ishpuini built on the legacy of his father over the previous 15 years, managing to build and fight at an unrelenting pace in an unforgiving place. Anywhere else in history, he would be remembered as exceptionally competent, wise, and talented. However, he clearly recognized that his father was an historically unusual genius, and he hewed quite closely to the path set before him. And then again, he seems to have recognized the particular ambition and power of his son. For how often in history do we see kings give over the final decade to a co-regency when the king himself is not obviously infirm for most of that period? Ishpuini seems to have had the divine humility to recognize that he was a transition between two geniuses, and he had the work ethic to make sure that he still pulled his weight during the interim. Menua, now that his father passes in the year 810 and he's ruling on his own, has two tremendous innovations to the Biainilli formula. He, more than anyone, is going to bring the unsettled hinterlands into the growing empire, managing a stable and long-term solution to the problem of nomadic peoples within a settled society. And he's going to bring canals to the mountains. Now that second is the most immediately and obviously impressive. The city of Tushpa is growing rapidly as plunder makes its way to the capital. Like any ancient ruler, he wants his primary region to be as full as possible, partly, for the associated prestige and luxury, but more importantly to bulk out the core of his army. Water, however, is a constant issue. Tushpa was founded at a perfect defensive site, but that means it's a good 50 miles away from the nearest continuously flowing river, leaving it reliant on rainwater and seasonal sources and wells. Menua builds and possibly also designs the Menua Canal. Now, this canal was really more of an aqueduct, one large enough to supply a city far larger than Tushpa. Without pumps, it ran along a course that carefully followed the contours of a terrain over 50 winding mountainous miles. Huge logs were carved out to construct bridges, bedrock was chiseled out to make flowways, and dry land was converted into an artificial river. A 50-mile canal down in Mesopotamia, where the land is already flat and it's mostly just dirt, well, that would have been the crowning achievement of a lot of petty kings in older times. But to do it in the mountains of the Armenian highlands requires not just an order of magnitude more labor, it requires a significantly higher level of straight-up engineering, much the way that the Panama Canal was way more difficult to build than the Suez Canal, just because you gotta fight the terrain. And Menua's empire is growing rapidly, with himself at the head of the armies, with himself undertaking the negotiations with tribes and clans, with himself constructing more fortresses than his father and grandfather combined. And yet, he didn't skimp on this canal. Menua built a canal so durable and so lasting that it still brings water, sometimes with the exact same stones and logs today. And from its construction around 800 BCE until 1950, when the local improvement boards finally needed to expand the capacity and replaced a lot of the structure with concrete, it was still the same canal. But even the modern concrete canal follows the same course as the ancient canal, and some of the stones of the original were left in place, still proudly proclaiming to this day that through the protection of the god Khaldi, Menua, son of Ishpuini, dug this canal. Its name is Menua, meaning canal of Menua. Through the greatness of the god Khaldi, I am Menua, strong king, great king, king of the Bia lands, lord of Tushpa city. Menua proclaims, anyone who destroys this inscription, who damages it, who makes anyone else do these things, or for those who might claim that they dug this canal, let the god Khaldi, and the storm god, and the sun god, and all the gods destroy him. Now, this canal wasn't the only thing Menua built, but it was the most significant. After all, things like the Egyptian pyramids may have survived longer, but let's be honest, they haven't really done anyone much good for all that they've been sitting there. Crafting a canal of logs and stone, of bridges and bedrock carvings, to provide water for 2 3/4 millennia for a city that has stood and grown since the time of its founding by Menua's grandfather, I find that to be in its own way rather more spectacular even than the pyramids and the ziggurats. This wasn't Menua's only domestic improvement, however. He's constantly reporting to us of the many new grain fields and orchards and vineyards and animal breeding facilities that he established throughout his rapidly expanding lands. He's terracing and spring tapping and cisterning and doing fountain construction, and all of this is increasing in pace throughout his reign. He seems to have built grain silos and banquet halls in places where we aren't aware of distinct fortifications being built, which could indicate that at least some parts of his realm were already so stable that he could both house logistics and host feasts for locals without significant defensive fortifications. Or it could be that it wasn't always actually all that stable in all those cases, but he might have wanted things to appear that way. After all, the appearance of invincibility would have been crucially important to the new kingdom, and some of that would be won on the battlefield, but things like this help to reinforce the perception of, hey, Menua doesn't need to build walls around his banquet hall. He's really confident. In a rare humanizing moment, there seems to have been an orchard even for Menua's wife, a bit out in the country from Tushpa. In an inscription, we hear that Menua's wife was named Tariria, and that she named her vineyard after herself. One might assume that a vineyard was the sort of thing that many royal wives might have owned, but I don't know that we often have direct evidence of it aside from this. Anyway, he also built a lot of temples, as one would expect, and seems to have at least presented himself as being as pious as his father had been. But all this comes together in one particular inscription, found at a site where he named Khaldi Patari, or Khaldi City. First, he constructed a fortress at this site, and crowned the fortress with a majestic gate, naturally dedicated to the national god Khaldi. Then he planted a vineyard and an orchard around the fortress, as well as established farming plots, probably also some pasture areas for the fortress as well. He then seems to have built a divine shrine into the great gate, and this structure by itself may have qualified as a temple to at least some degree, because Menua then establishes a new religious holiday and harvest ritual just for this town. because we forget that a lot nowadays. But for most of the world, holidays and festivals were things that primarily existed only at the local level. National religion was often just sort of the coincidence that many local places were affected by the culture, climate, and traditions of their neighbors. And festivals often had a much more local character than our festivals have today. But that aside, the establishment of the religious ritual, a round of libations and some animal sacrifices and general celebration, that seems to have been the capstone of the establishment of this fortress town, having taken care of its defense, its economics, and its religion. It's important to note that Menua is not just building fortress structures, he's building whole institutions like this. And he's doing so, remember, at a tremendously rapid rate. In fact, there starts to be significant evidence in this period, and for the rest of Urartian history, that they started building what are essentially forts, but without the citadel, or possibly not even much fort at all. These are called tribal centers. I mean, we have no idea what the Biainilli would have called them, but they're scattered widely throughout the highlands. But they're almost universally basically in the middle of nowhere. They aren't on known major trade or transport routes, and while they do have some water and soil, they're not in strongly settled agricultural areas. They are, however, all located near or on a rock-cut tomb. These tombs themselves typically being out in the middle of nowhere, and thus associated with the highland nomads that some estimates suggest may have been the majority of the population. There's no suggestion that the settled Biainilli kingdom was building these rock-cut tombs. Rather, it seems that either Ishpuini or Menua had the clever idea of building these administrative outposts at sites that were religiously or ancestrally significant to the highland nomads, not at places that were otherwise tactically important. Because, of course, for nomadic or even semi-nomadic peoples, very few locations genuinely are tactically important. Thus, in order to actually control these mobile people, you have to put your static control center in the few places that you know they're going to be, no matter how inconvenient this might be for your own logistical train. And when you put it that way, it seems kind of obvious and logical, but at the same time, settled societies have struggled to deal with nomads for basically all of human history. And I genuinely don't know any other civilization that came across the same or similar solution as this. And here, when I say leave a comment, it's kind of engagement bait. It's for boosting the algorithm. But in this case, I genuinely am perplexed. If you can think of any other historical examples of a similar system to this, do let me know, because I'm very interested in this. Anyway, we know of at least 20 ruins of these tribal centers scattered around the place, plus a notable number of other mounds that could possibly be tells from tribal centers. So there were a bunch of them, and we know that they managed to integrate the nomads into the wider society. They provided supplies for the nomads in the sense that it was a trading station, but it was also a defensive structure. Not a citadel, but all you need is, some walls, some water, and some stockpiles when the main enemy in the region is just other raiding nomads. It was also a religious and administrative center, so it had everything you could possibly ask for in terms of attracting nomads to hang out at your control point. In return, it provided a bit of predictability and regularity for the Biainilli state. They could know how to find and contact the nomads when they needed them to hand over soldiers and horses, which was, of course, the main thing Urartu was interested in extracting from their nomadic neighbors. It's a keen system, and it's one that's likely going to yield more interesting stories as further research progresses. But the key question is, how voluntary was association with these tribal centers for the nomads around them? Was this an outpost for the control of a conquered people? Or was it more of an embassy established sort of for junior partners in the Biainilli coalition? As always, we guess there's at least a bit of both. I can't imagine that these tribal centers would have been effective without at least a bit of buy-in from the Highlanders. In the extreme, they could have all banded together to destroy them. On the other hand, you can hardly imagine such a fractious people not needing a bit of occasional clubbing to keep them in line from time to time. But very little writing has been recovered from any of these places. I know of only one inscription of any kind, and we don't hear hardly anything about them directly in the written record. So this is a story we're telling almost exclusively from archaeology. Still, the Highland culture, at least from a material standpoint, may have been rather more consistent and uniform than the lowland culture over the entire region from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea. They share a consistent pottery style and other lifestyle markers. And while they weren't politically unified, once the Urartian kings figured out this approach, they seem to have applied it across their growing empire as they expanded. And anywhere that they were able to control the local settled populations, it seems they were able to control the Highlanders as well. Veering a little bit into speculation, this may also have been part of the Biainilli expansion strategy, as getting Highlanders on side first may have helped more quickly integrate the settled villages that the Highland nomads habitually preyed on. I don't think we have a clear sense from the data as to which way that went in practice. And with all this, we can say that Urartu, the kingdom of Biainilli, is now well and truly and properly founded, with its core features now distinguished and its territory solidly expanded over the period of 835 to 800 BCE. Menua will continue to rule and expand his territory along similar lines, and we have a particularly interesting set of wars against an even more obscure and even more northerly kingdom, which will, 150 years later, ultimately lead to Urartu's final collapse. But we're not going to get to that quite yet. Instead, I want to pause and take a look at one of the most distinct and important industries of Urartu, which is, of course, ironworking. We've talked about metals in general and iron in specific before, but by looking at cross-cultural comparisons, I want to try and ponder who it was that made all the fine iron that the Highlands were famous for, and do it in sort of a day-in-the-life style episode like we did, I think, 2 years ago for the farmers and laborers and weavers of Mesopotamia. So join us next time for a miner, a smelter, and a smith as we look at the daily lives of metalworkers in ancient Urartu. Thank you for listening.